Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to map out a truly fascinating century-long history. We're looking at the evolution of Indian peasant resistance from 1857 all the way to 1947. You'll see how localized, kind of disconnected riots, born out of just sheer absolute desperation, eventually transformed into massive organized anti-colonial forces that literally shaped the future of a nation. It's an incredible story of resilience, and it's all laid out for us in the data. Let's get started. To make sense of this massive, complex web of revolts, we're going to follow a logical, chronological journey. We'll start with the colonial agrarian crisis, move right into early localized peasant uprisings, and look at the limits of early resistance. After that, we'll hit the 20th century political awakening, dive into post-war guerrilla movements, and finally wrap up with the legacy of resistance. Section 1. The Colonial Agrarian Crisis. Now, to really grasp the sheer scale of this resistance, we've got to first establish the crushing weight and the high stakes of the system these peasants were actually living under. The impoverishment of the Indian peasantry wasn't just, bad luck. It was the direct result of a drastically altered agrarian structure built on four main pillars. First, colonial economic policies completely ruined traditional handicrafts. This forced millions of people back into farming, causing massive land overcrowding. Then you've got the new land revenue systems. If you lived in a zamindari or landlord-controlled area, you suffered high rents, illegal levies, arbitrary evictions, and forced unpaid labor. And if you were in a riot-wari area, where the government taxed peasants directly, well, it wasn't much better. The government itself levied incredibly heavy taxes. Add all that to the fact that the entire colonial administrative and judicial system was basically hardwired against the peasant. Section 2. Early localized peasant uprisings. Faced with this totally overwhelming system, you might assume the peasants were just passive victims, right? But the historical record shows us they absolutely were not. Driven by immediate, unbearable grievances, they pushed back. Across the mid to late 19th century, we see a flurry of intense activity. Right at the start of our timeline, we've got the Indigo Revolt in Bengal from 1859 to 1860. Then, the Pabna Agrarian Leagues form in the 1870s and 80s, and the Deccan Riots erupt in 1874. When you look at this chronological sequence, you realize these uprisings were popping up all over the place, in totally different regions of India, even though they were largely disconnected from one another. Take the Indigo Revolt, for example. Just imagine being trapped by a fraudulent contract, forced by European planters to grow indigo instead of much more profitable food crops like rice, all while under the constant threat of severe physical intimidation. We're talking kidnappings, flogging, having your home destroyed, but the peasants finally drew a line. Led by grassroots leaders, the brothers Digambar Biswas and Bishnu Biswas, they decided to just stop. They refused to grow indigo under duress. They stood up to the planters' armed guards and the local police, and their resistance was so fiercely effective that, believe it or not, indigo cultivation was practically wiped out from Bengal by the end of 1860. And this brilliantly illustrates the kind of escalation we see in the Deccan Riots a few years later. Over in Western India, the riots, or peasants, were just suffocating under heavy taxation and trapped by outsider moneylenders. Notice how incredibly organized their pushback was here. Step 1, a complete social boycott. Nobody would buy from the moneylenders' shops. Barbers and shoemakers refused to serve them. Step 2, this tension eventually boiled over into direct agrarian riots. And Step 3, they went straight for the source of their misery. They systematically seized debt bonds and deeds and publicly burned them. Section 3, the limits of early resistance. Now, these 19th century stories of defiance are incredible, for sure, but as we pivot to analyze the movement as a whole, we do have to look objectively at their inherent weaknesses. The contrast between these two eras is pretty stark. The 19th century movements were incredibly brave, but their territorial reach was super localized. They focused purely on immediate economic issues, maybe a specific oppressive landlord or a fraudulent planter. The massive gap here is that colonialism itself wasn't the target yet. They lacked a broader anti-colonial ideology and didn't really possess a conception of an alternative society. But, actually, this sets the stage perfectly for the massive shift we're about to see in the 1900s, where movements become deeply integrated with a national freedom struggle. Section 4. 20th Century Political Awakening. This is where our explainer narrative really hits the gas. We enter an era where peasant struggles merge directly with the national movement, and we see an absolute explosion of organized, interconnected groups. You've got the Kisan Sabhas in UP, with leaders like Baba Ramchandra successfully bringing local issues right to the attention of national figures like Jawaharlal Nehru. There's the Mapilo Revolt in Malabar, where Muslim tenants' historical grievances against landlords merged with the wider Khilafat agitation. And we see the founding of the All India Kisan Congress in 1936. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the Ekta, or unity movement, led by low-caste leaders like Madari Posse. They used this fascinating, symbolic religious ritual where assembled peasants would physically vow to pay only the recorded rent, refuse forced labor, and stand united. It was a brilliant, culturally resonant tool for grassroots organizing. Another perfect example of this advanced 20th century organization is the Bardoli Satyagraha in 1926. When authorities tried to hike land revenue by a totally unjustified 30%, Vallabhava Patel stepped in to lead a massive tax strike. He was so effective that the local women gave him the title Sardar. Patel organized the region meticulously. He set up 13 workers' camps, published a bulletin to mobilize opinion, and even created an intelligence wing to make sure all tenants followed the strike's resolutions. It was so highly coordinated that Gandhi himself traveled to Bardoli just to be on standby in case of an emergency. Section 5. Post-war guerrilla movements. All right, now we reach the climax of our historical journey. Following World War II, peasant movements escalated into massive, intense militant actions. A major flashpoint was the Tebhaga Movement in Bengal in 1946. Let's clearly define the core economic demand here. Tebhaga literally translates to a 2/3 share. The Bengal provincial Kisan Sabhas demanded that sharecroppers, the bargadars who were out there actually working the land, should get 2/3 of the crop, leaving only 1/3 for the landlords or jotadars. This was a radical, massive shift from the traditional half-and-half split they were used to. And their central rallying cry was just incredibly powerful. Nij kamare dan tolo, which means take the paddy to your own threshing floor. The energy surrounding this was absolutely electric. Communist cadres and urban student militias actually went out into the countryside to help organize the peasants, and it brought people together across deep social divides. Low-caste groups and Muslims participated side by side in massive numbers to enforce this new economic reality. At the exact same time, down south in the princely state of Hyderabad, anger was just boiling over against an oppressive system known as veti. So veti refers to gross forms of forced, unpaid labor exacted by landlords, who were known as doras, and the ruling elite under the Nizam. This system completely stripped peasants of their basic political and civil liberties. The resulting uprising against this system was staggering in its sheer size. 3 million. 3 million people across 3,000 villages were involved in the Telangana movement. To put that into perspective, this became the biggest peasant guerrilla war in modern Indian history. Facing the brutal repression of the Nizam's stormtroopers, the peasants organized village sangams and fought back using literally whatever they had on hand: lathis, stone slings, and even chili powder. It was a massive, sustained conflict that only finally fizzled out when Indian security forces took over Hyderabad. Section 6. The Legacy of Resistance. Which brings us to our resolution. We've traced nearly 100 years of struggle. So what is the final balance sheet? Through localized riots, massive tax strikes, and full-blown guerrilla warfare, these united actions systematically broke down the system of subordination that began under colonialism. They eroded the power of the landed class. They forced a major transformation in the agrarian structure. They proved, without a doubt, that the peasantry could be united under a nationalist ideology. But maybe most importantly, they created the undeniable, unavoidable atmosphere needed for post-independence agrarian reforms. Which leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder. How did these century-long pre-independence peasant struggles fundamentally force the eventual abolition of the zamindari system in a newly independent India? You see, the roots of modern Indian agriculture and its reforms were shaped right here, in the fires of these rural uprisings. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing the data and keep questioning the history behind the structures we see today.